Today, Australia's Treasurers came together, Commonwealth, State and Territory, for an important meeting. It was followed by the Treasurers' Population Forum, in which my two colleagues, Alan Tudge, the Minister for Population, and David Coleman, the Minister for Immigration, attended. They were constructive meetings and good progress was made. Australia's federation is an asset, not a liability. And indeed, Australians expect us to work together to get stuff done, to put aside our political differences and to act in their best interests. And that's what occurred today in a very constructive meeting between federal, state and territory treasurers. The first item of business was for treasurers to be briefed on developments in the global economy and in the domestic economy. And in that context, there was an extensive discussion about the productivity challenge facing Australia. Indeed, our 30-year average for productivity growth has been 1.5%. But over the last 5 years, that has fallen to just 0.7%. And are we able to get the productivity up to 1.5, which is our goal, then that will be worth more than $3,000 a year to someone on average income, and more than $70 billion to the Australian economy. The meeting was briefed by the Chairman of the Productivity Commission, and we agreed to take forward a number of actionable items to boost productivity, namely in the environment space, in the health space, in infrastructure, in skills, and in transport reform. On infrastructure, I asked the Treasurers to ask their leaders to respond to the Prime Minister's letter putting forward potential projects that could be brought forward for infrastructure projects. We have received a letter back from Queensland, but we haven't received a letter back from the other states and territories. Obviously, we will look at those suggestions on a case-by-case basis, and clearly there are some capacity constraints in some of the larger economies, namely in New South Wales and in Victoria. We also agreed that our senior officials would come together quickly to look at the capacity constraints that exist in the building of infrastructure and provide advice to treasurers, bringing together issues related to skills, to materials, whether it's bitumen, cement, diesel, or equipment, boring equipment and the like, and to provide some advice as to how we can deal with those capacity constraints. There was also an extensive discussion about national funding agreements, because the leaders, premiers and the Prime Minister and Chief Ministers agreed that treasurers would now have greater oversight over national funding agreements and be more actively involved. Portfolio ministers would still lead, but that the treasurers will be more actively involved in those funding agreements. And so we had a discussion about the health funding agreement, as well as the progress in implementing the NDIS, which is obviously the most significant social reform this country has seen in decades. And there was one additional tangible agreement, which was for Australia's first population planning framework, which was agreed by the states, which is absolutely critically important because obviously the states have control over a number of levers with respect to population, namely in infrastructure spending as well as in housing approvals and the like. But I'll ask Alan and then David to talk more at length about those particular areas. Alan.
Well, thank you very much, Treasurer. Well, today is an historic day because for the first time, the states and territories and the Commonwealth Government have agreed a national population planning framework, which aligns each of our respective responsibilities to better manage the population challenges in the future. Now, this is the culmination of almost 12 months of good cooperative work, which has been undertaken between federal ministers and state and territory ministers, and has been then endorsed at the Treasurers' Forum today and will go for final endorsement at COAG later this year. Now, this is one of a series of steps that we have been taking over the last 12 months where we've had an acute focus on some of the population challenges. You recall that Prime Minister Morrison, when he became Prime Minister, established the population portfolio. in recognition that population settings underpin our economic success and have such a critical impact on the livability and sustainability of our cities and our regions. And since then, we've taken a number of steps. We outlined in March, for example, our first ever population plan, which made a number of decisions in relation to migration, which David will refer to, as well as more congestion busting infrastructure, more economic development in the regions, as well as foreshadowed that we wanted to develop a planning framework with the states and territories because they have so many of the levers which are relevant to how we manage our future population growth. Just last week, we formally launched our new Centre for Population, which is a new capability inside of Treasury to better integrate our data, provide analysis, better forecasting and policy advice to ourselves and indeed to the states and territories. And today, though, is arguably the most important step, which is the integration of states and territories with the federal government in terms of how we will manage the population pressures together into the future. Very specifically, it agreed that we would have better data sharing. It also agreed that we'd have better forecasting and common forecasting across the nation. And this is, of course, so important to get that right and then to be able to track what those forecasts have been as to whether or not we're meeting those forecasts so that there's no surprises. And also foreshadowed and agreed greater transparency more generally about what is occurring in terms of our population and what are the drivers of that population and how we are tracking against it. So it's been an important mechanism. It will culminate in what has been agreed today in a population plan which is developed every 3 years and a population statement which is also collaboratively developed every year and which monitors the progress against that plan, that 3-yearly plan. So it's been a very productive meeting today. As I said, it's the culmination of 12 months of good, constructive, collaborative work with the states and territories. And it means that together we'll be able to better manage our population growth going into the future.
David.
Thanks, Treasurer, and good afternoon. Well, today was a really productive discussion with the states about immigration in the context of the population plan that Alan's just referred to. We talked about the outcomes of last year's permanent migration plan with a total number of spaces of just over 160,000, which was the lowest in 10 years. We talked about the fact that the cap for this year is 160,000 places. And importantly, we also talked about the importance not only of the total number, but also of the distribution of immigration around Australia. Because the reality is that we have significantly different levels of population growth in different parts of Australia and different immigration needs in different parts of Australia. And that's why in this financial year, the government has allocated 23,000 spots within the immigration plan for people who commit to live and work in regional Australia for at least 3 years. And people who do that will be eligible for permanent residency. In Sydney and Melbourne in particular, we've seen significant population growth, but that's not the case in many parts of Australia. And there are many parts of Australia that are crying out for more skilled immigration, and our plan will help to deliver that. Another important part of our collaboration with the states is an increased number of places allocated for visas that are nominated by the states. And in this year, compared to last year, there's a 38% increase in the number of visas that will be put forward as nominations by the states. And that's about that collaborative approach of working with the states, because of course the states have a great understanding of what's required in their particular area. So it was a really useful discussion today.
Thank you. Phil.
Treasury, it was quite a while ago that the Prime Minister wrote to the Premiers to nominate some projects. Why is it, do you think, only one has so far come back? And secondly, when they do come back, is the Commonwealth prepared to give more money on top of the $100 billion towards these Tier 2 and Tier 3 projects if they're identified as vital?
Well, the first question is one you have to direct to them. The second is that what we're suggesting is that there are potentially projects within that 10-year pipeline that could be brought forward. But the key challenge here, Phil, is if you bring some of the spending forward, can you also bring the construction timetable forward? And we are so we are hitting some of those capacity constraints, and they're across machinery, they're across inputs, they're across also skills. And what we discussed today is perhaps not always using a tier 1 or a tier 2 contractor, but some of the smaller providers. The state's talked about maintenance programs. As you know, we currently provide significant funding for road maintenance, both through the states directly, but also through local government. So they know that we're spending a lot on infrastructure. By the way, the states are spending a lot on infrastructure too, record amounts, and the capacity constraints are real. But what we do want to do is work with them, and as the RBA governor has said, it's important to have a pipeline of infrastructure that is continually updated and increased over time.
But it's also, Phil, why we're spending so much time on these smaller scale projects and trying to get those very rapidly up and running, because they're less reliant upon the tier 1 and tier 2 contractors, many of whom are at capacity constraints.
It's incumbent on the states to move more quickly. Shouldn't they be deal with
They're
this by
partners
now?
in this.
Well, they're partners in this, and so I've been having constructive conversations with each of my respective counterparts right across Australia to really get cracking on these projects, and we want to see them done as quickly as possible, as do they. But we've also been leaning forward on critical projects like the Monash Freeway, where we did provide some additional money just recently, so we can really get cracking in terms of stage 2 of the Monash, and it will get going from January of next year from memory.
Shane.
Yeah, Tricia, I just want to make sure we're talking, because some states have already announced some smaller level like maintenance in Victoria's SA and WA. The things that you're looking for are on top of what those states are already doing in that space.
Well, it could be whether it's in maintenance, it could be whether it's in some of the larger scale projects, provided there's no capacity constraints. You see Western Australia or South Australia don't have some of those challenges that you see in Sydney and Melbourne. You saw the Treasurer from Victoria today say in the paper that there were very significant capacity constraints in his state, and the Monash project that Alan referred to has seen cost inflation, which is quite significant. So we're prepared to consider on a case-by-case basis states putting forward projects that can be brought forward, recognising the importance of continuing that infrastructure rollout. Andrew.
Treasurer,
Sorry.
Also Minister Treasurer as well, and Minister Conn. Just what does the population plan look like? I mean, are we talking about trying to funnel population growth between a particular parameter? And does it involve trying to stop greedy government simply plonking housing and so on in areas that doesn't have any infrastructure like buses and trains and jobs and so on?
Well, let Alan and David comment as well. But can I just say one thing,
Sorry.
Alan? I was just going to say, if you look back at our 2002 IGR report, it estimated that Australia would hit 25 million people by 2040. As you know, we hit that number last year. And in Melbourne, where you've got 2.5% population growth per annum averaged over the last decade, which is the fastest growing city in the country, this is putting huge pressure, Andrew, on public transport and putting huge pressure on services. So it's about understanding the demographic shifts, understanding where people are going, better sharing data between the federal and state government so that we can plan together. And as Alan's been working on, states who are the primary distributors of infrastructure funding in many cases, as well as having control over housing approvals and the like, they need to be part of this discussion to better manage population. But Alan?
No, I think that was a good summary, Josh, and you can go back to our March population plan, and we updated this just recently as well. And it points out that we've got a number of objectives with our population plan. One, of course, is to support economic growth, and our population settings are critical in that regard because obviously it supports overall GDP growth, but it also supports our productivity and our participation rates. So it supports per capita GDP growth as well. So critically, we want for that to continue. But there's also immense challenges around the livability of our cities and the sustainability of some of our areas that we need to have at the forefront as well. And we know, for example, that 3/4 of all of the entire continent's population growth is into 3 locations right now, Melbourne, Sydney and South East Queensland, which are growing very rapidly by international standards. Yet you've got other smaller cities and some regional areas which are literally crying out for more people and wanting to grow more rapidly. We've also got cases of our largest cities where a lot of the jobs growth will be in the city centres, but a lot of the growth in terms of housing and where the growth in people is on the outskirts of the cities. And so you've got a mismatch there between jobs, where the jobs are and where the people are. So our population plan is leaning in on these things. A, to get a better distribution of our population growth, to support the growth of the smaller cities and the regions and ease a little bit of that population pressure off the big capitals. B, to get a better distribution even inside some of our capital cities. And a Western City deal is a critical component of that, for example, because the aim there is for people to live, work and play all in Western Sydney so they don't have to commute into the CBD for work. And of course maintaining the sustainability of that on an ongoing basis. But the states and territories have a critical role here, because whereas we have the primary responsibility for the population growth levers, being the migration rate, they have the primary responsibilities for the infrastructure, the housing approvals and services. And we need to make sure that those are very closely aligned, and that's particularly what this framework is about today.
David.
Yeah, and I think another way of sort of adding to that is, say, the immigration system has always had a strong view about the total number of people. What we're doing now is using the visa system to also focus on the distribution of where those people go. So the 23,000 people for regional areas is about saying we know places like South Australia are crying out for more people. We know we have high population growth, particularly in Sydney, Melbourne and South East Queensland. So it's about a smarter approach to not only the total number of people, but also the distribution of people within the country. And we've done a number of what we call designated area migration agreements. There's 7 of these around the country. And these are about focusing on particular areas where there's a persistent gap in skills and a persistent need for immigration to fill those gaps, generally in country areas, and working with those regions to help the immigration system fill those gaps. So it's about being more targeted in the way we manage immigration.
In Queensland's letter, what were the specific projects that it's nominated? And although you haven't had formal responses from the other states yet, have you had any perhaps verbal indications about what they're looking at?
Well, look, in terms of that letter, we're continuing to have that discussion about Queensland, about various projects that they put in that letter, so we haven't made that public per se. But in terms of other states, it's an ongoing discussion with them. But as I said, there's real capacity constraints in some of those states.
Surely you can tell us like at least how many. I mean, are they grand like new?
Cross River Rail.
Are they new state?
Well, I think they've accepted our position.
Our position's pretty clear
on that one. But I mean, obviously, one of the issues with Queensland that we were keen to progress is the approvals with relation to the Melbourne-Brisbane inland rail as well, because as you know, that's going to create 16,000 jobs. That's going to significantly improve the freight capacity, be able to get goods to market much quicker. So we're talking to Queensland about a range of projects.
What type of project is it then? I mean, are they little supermarkets or grand stadiums? What are
You'll just have to leave that to your imagination, Andrew. Yes.
Treasurer, is Australia still on track to smash its Paris climate targets?
We're on track to beat our 2020 target, and we're confident that we will meet and beat our 2030 target. As you know, when we came to government, we inherited a deficit on our 2020 target. Now we're going to overachieve quite significantly on that. The point about the energy sector and our emissions targets is you need to have a cost-effective transition. And that's why we've put in place a series of measures to do that. We beat our first Kyoto target, we'll beat our 2020 target, and we're confident we'll beat our 2030
The
target.
IMF says we're not going to meet our targets even with a $111 carbon tax. Is the IMF...
Sorry, Labor said that.
No, the IMF.
Right. Well, we're confident we will meet and beat our targets. And as you know, at the election, we laid out our $3.5 billion climate solutions package with a range of measures. Bill Shorten and the Labor Party went to the election with an unfunded, uncosted commitment to reducing emissions by 45%. We now see an internal war within the Labor Party about their own climate targets. You've had a member of the right, a leader of the right, Joel Fitzgibbon, dial a quote these days, getting up and saying that Labor should mimic the coalition's emissions reduction targets. And as quick as you could say Jack Robinson, you had Mark Butler there jumping in from the left, Albo's right-hand man, saying no, we're going to stay the course. No doubt you'll have another minister who will jump up tomorrow. It seems every aspiring Labor leader is hanging their shingle out, whether it's Joel Fitzgibbon, or whether it's Jim Chalmers, or last night whether it's Richard Marles. They're all wanting to have a go, and the Labor Party's a real shambles. Last question.
Can I ask Minister Coleman, do you agree with the assessment that the Communist Party of China and their policies are inconsistent with our own values?
Well, I think in many cases, yes. We work very closely with China very cooperatively in economic matters and so on. But as a nation, we obviously have our own democratic values, and we won't always agree on different matters.
Are they responsible for intellectual property theft and for hacking of government and non-government bodies within Australia?
Well, look, I know Mr Dutton made some comments on those matters earlier today, and I'm not going to add further to those, but we'll always stand up for Australia's interest, and we'll always put Australia first, and we'll work collaboratively with our many partners around the world, including China, which is a strong partner of Australia.
Australia and China have very